and start lowering the engine. Whoa! Hi, I'm Cliff, and this is my garage. And if this is your first time joining me, thanks for dropping by. Today, we're going to have a quick little demonstration of how you drop the engine in the Cayman. Now, I don't mean drop the engine out of the Cayman. That's a totally different thing that would involve disconnecting fuel lines, vacuum lines, coolant lines, electrical lines, the exhaust system, all sorts of stuff. And the only way I can imagine ever doing that would be if I managed to blow up the engine or I was going to replace it with something else. No, what we're going to talk about today is simply lowering the engine a little bit. Specifically, we're going to tilt the engine down. So we're going to drop the front of the engine by about 3 inches or so. And while we're leaving the rear of the engine in position. Now, why would you want to do that? Well, there's a couple of reasons, mainly having to do with the incredible lack of space in between the front of the engine and the firewall behind the seats. The space is so tight, it is extremely difficult, if not impossible, to do some maintenance items. For instance, replacing the vacuum pump, which I had blow up on me during a track day at Roebling Road recently. Another example would be trying to replace the somewhat prone to failure water pump on the Cayman. The standard water pump has a plastic impeller that tends not to stand up to time. They tend to go out around 50,000 miles or so. And so that's a very common thing to replace. The main reason they get replaced is because there's a failure of the plastic impeller. The actual thing that drives the water is made of plastic. I'm sure Porsche doesn't call it plastic. They probably call it some sort of advanced composite or something. Bottom line, it's not metal. And it's very common to take and replace the water pump, the broken water pump, with a functional one that has a metal impeller. In fact, a lot of people at around 50,000 miles simply replace the water pump as a sort of preemptive strike against water pump failure. Lowering the front of the engine is surprisingly simple. You only have to absolutely remove 4 nuts, although there are some other things that it's probably a good idea to go ahead and loosen up to give you more wiggle room, because you really don't want to overstretch or pop off things like coolant hoses. And so I'm going to show you some other things that you can remove to make the job a little bit safer. Now, the difficult part of dropping the engine is the fact you have to hold the engine. Now, Porsche has a special lifting device. I forget the exact name they call it. It may just be called lifting device. That's essentially a hydraulic work cart or work table, similar to the one that I have. And there's also a special engine cradle sort of device that's designed to attach to the engine and hold it. Now, we're not going to need that special cradle because we're not going to actually remove the engine. Instead, all we're going to do is loosen those 4 bolts and then carefully lower the front of the engine to get access to whatever it is you're working on. So this is what I came up with in order to hold the engine and adjust it up and down. And this is 3 of my 2x4 piers that I built, or raised platforms. I don't know what you officially call them, but it's just 10 layers of 2x4s alternating back and forth with deck screws driven down through them. And then on the top layer, I've got an additional pair that are in the middle to form a top platform. So it ends up making a 15-inch cube. Super handy, one of the best things I've ever done. I use them all the time. For example, when I'm doing an alignment on the Cayman, I need to have the weight fully down on all 4 wheels, so that, or all 4 tires, so that the suspension isn't hanging. And if I do that on the floor, well, now the Cayman is so low that I can't get under there and reach the adjustments. So that's what these are great for. It holds the entire car 15 inches up off the floor, and now I can do my alignments with no problem. I've also used them multiple times around the garage and around the house. If nothing else, they also make a great impromptu seat if you just need to take a rest. The spot where I want to hold the engine, where I want it to sit on top of these piers, is kind of recessed up in the engine, and it's between a pair of coolant pipes. So that's why I have these additional pieces of 2x up here. I've got a 2x6 that goes across the top platform, and note that it's going across the other 2x4s to distribute the weight as much as possible. And then I've got another one just to lift up and get a little more clearance to start reaching up in there. And then this final one is the one that squeezes up between those two coolant pipes, and the engine mount rests right on this. Also notice I've cut a little 1/4 inch groove using a table saw because there's a little reinforcement web that's on the engine mount, and it nestles right down there into the slot so that that engine mount can sit solidly on here without rocking on that reinforcement web or making me put the engine mount way up here to clear that mount. So just a little detail to try and make this as safe and secure as possible. This entire setup sits on top of my Harbor Freight hydraulic table, which is hands down one of the best things I've ever bought for the shop. I got it, oh, probably 10, 15 years ago. At the time, I think it was regularly like $200, and I had one of Harbor Freight's super special 20% off of anything. And so I got it for just $160, and I have used it so very, very much. Now, today, this same 1,000-pound hydraulic cart will run you 300, I think $370 at Harbor Freight. Still absolutely worth it. And they have, sometimes it's on sale, sometimes there's a coupon available, whatever. It is very, very much worth the money, or at least it has been to me. We wouldn't necessarily have to have the hydraulic cart to make this work. The alternative would be you could put the piers, and you probably would want to use a fourth one maybe. That starts getting kind of high, would make me a little nervous. But you could put the piers on the floor and then lower the lift down, engage the piers, cut loose the motor mount, and then raise the lift back up somewhere to pick the car up and kind of leave the engine behind as it goes. I thought about this, but I didn't really like the idea because it's a little tough to do fine movements with the lift. If I want to pick it up just a little bit, you can see how much it starts bouncing around. Now, if that's your only alternative, and also if you want to lower it just a hair, there's a lot of bouncing going on, and that just makes me nervous. So I chose to use the hydraulic cart, and it does work perfectly well. One thing you're going to need to do to get ready for this job is remove this underbody panel from the bottom of the car. It sits right at the front of the engine and keeps things like rocks and debris from being thrown up and hitting the front of the engine, where your serpentine belt and pulleys and that kind of stuff is at. It's held on with, I think, 3 Torx screws and a couple of 10mm plastic nuts. One thing that's kind of optional is to remove this underbody panel from the car, and it's the one that sits in front of the other one right down the middle, and that kind of protects various lines that run through there. For instance, there's a couple of coolant lines that go through there. And when you're lowering the engine, it's connected to those coolant lines, and even though you could possibly do this, and you probably could do it without damaging those coolant lines or kinking them up, I just went the extra step, removed this underbody panel, and released the clamps holding those lines so they're free to move with the engine, or more like this, move with the engine Probably, possibly not necessary, but I'm kind of paranoid about things like that. Now, in order to get this one loose, it has there are studs on the bottom of the car, and it goes into these slots and is held on with some more of those 10 millimeter nuts. The thing is that this panel goes on, and then the side panels go on top or underneath since they're on the bottom. But basically, they overlap on top of this. So you might be able to just loosen these nuts and wiggle this out of there. I just went ahead and removed one side panel. It made it super simple to get out of there. That side panel is held on mostly with those 10 millimeter plastic nuts. I believe there is one Torx screw that holds it in place. So just keep, look around there. I started to say just keep taking out screws and nuts until it falls off, but maybe that's not the best way to do it. Okay, let's pick the car up, get under there. I'll show you the stuff that I'm talking about in terms of taking those coolant lines loose, show you where the motor mount is, and we'll get ready to actually drop this engine. Well, hopefully not drop it, but lower it. Once I've got the car up in the air all the way, then I'm going to take and lower it down a bit so that it comes down on the safety catches. I don't want the hydraulic system leaking back and letting the car drop while I've got this motor cut loose and attached to something else. And here we are up under the car. Just to get you oriented, this is the oil pan of the engine, and the front of the engine is right here. And the front of the car, of course, is down that way. And you can see the coolant hoses that run to the radiators in the front of the car. This is what that first panel I talked about covers up. And the second panel, it goes over this area here. This piece right here, this is what we're looking for. This is the motor mount. The front of the engine hooks into this cross piece here, and there's a vibration isolation bushing up in there. Kind of a funny quirk of the English language. We call this an engine, whereas the British call it a motor. Here in America, motor is an electric motor. These things are engines, but this thing that holds the engine, we call that a motor mount. This right here, this cross piece, this is where we want that block I was showing you to rest. And this is that real reinforcing web I was talking about that goes into that groove that I cut in. Initially, I looked at and tried using this point right here to hold the engine, but this cantilever's out, and there was quite a lot of flex as I put pressure up on this point, and that made me kind of nervous about breaking it off. So I said, okay, never mind. I'm going to go and try and figure out how to use this point instead, because this is much more solid. And as you can see, like I was talking about, that block has to go up in between these two coolant hoses. The way this is all held together is there are 4 studs, 2 on each side, that come down from the body, and then they go through the motor mount, and then you put nuts on, or there are nuts on there. We're going to remove the 2 inner ones, because once we've got the block and everything in place, it's kind of hard to get to them. And then once we got it all supported, we'll remove the outer nuts and be able to drop the engine down. And as this engine comes down, it's going to start pulling down or pushing down on these coolant hoses. And so that will come down with the engine and motor mount when they shift down. But there is this support bracket back here, and there's probably enough flex here where you're okay, but it just makes me kind of nervous. So this brace, this is why I was saying remove this body panel, and then this brace is held on by just a couple of 10 millimeter nuts. It's all attached to the pipe, but this is now free to move. And then even further back, or further forward, there's this other brace that holds the pipes in place, the solid aluminum pipes. Again, there's probably now plenty of flex for these to move down with the engine, but just being paranoid, I'm going to remove this cross brace, and it's held on by 4 E14 bolts. You're going to need to get an external Torx bolts. You're going to need to get E-Torx sockets. There are E-Torx sockets all over this car. So an investment, I'll give you a link in the video description below of everything I use in this episode. This is one of those things that they're really inexpensive and they've been real lifesavers. And again, this is all held together, clipped on there, but now, as you can see, this is free to move. Now, don't get confused by this plate and bolt and nut here. There's also 2 more up here, and there's one on the side here. I'm not sure if it's in view. These are for my 6-point, oh, and there's also one over there too. These are for the 6-point safety harness, and they're not going to be on your car unless you've installed your safety harness the same way I have. So let's remove the 2 inner nuts of the motor mount. And this is a 16mm socket. I'm using a deep socket so I can reach up in there. If you don't have a deep socket, of course, you could just use a regular socket with a short extension or a long one. As you can imagine, these are torqued up pretty good. And while we're at it, let's go ahead and loosen up the outside ones. Now you may be thinking, why not use an impact wrench or an impact driver to get those loose? These are studs that are welded or up in the body. The last thing on earth I want to do is break one of them off. On the other hand, once they're loose, an impact wrench or an impact driver is much faster. Again, I'm only removing the 2 inner nuts. I'm leaving, well, drop that one. Come back. I'm leaving the 2 outer ones, and I'll release those once I've got my support in place. So now we need to put this thing in position. The thing is, the exact position it needs to be in is going to depend on what you're trying to work on. For instance, if I'm trying to work on the vacuum pump that's right here in this position, well, you can see I'm going to be kind of running into it. Likewise with the water pump on the other side. So you need to put this thing off center and just sliding the blocks it's going to sit on to one side or the other. Now I'm going to be working on the vacuum pump, so I want this as far over that way as I can get. So we'll get that in position, and then we'll adjust the side to side position of the actual lift. Gonna get this sort of close. Lift it up some. And we just start playing with the alignment using that notch to get this thing set up. Pick it up a little closer. Yeah, I think there, that's the right position. And now, looking carefully, and it's a little hard to see, I normally would have a headlamp on, but let's use my flashlight. There, okay, now we've made contact. We've got good, solid position here. Make sure that you lock the wheels on the hydraulic cart. Okay, we're ready to cut this thing loose and lower it. Removing this nut is very easy because there's nice clear access to it. This side's a little tougher because you're having to work around the platform. I'm going to remove the socket and just use my fingers to turn it now because the bolt is, or rather the nut is really loose. Okay. All right, here we go. I'm going to very carefully and slowly squeeze this trigger or the release on this hydraulic cart and start lowering the engine. Whoa, that wasn't very, got a little rambunctious there. Okay, so, all right, so I've got the top of the motor mount down to just about the end of the, there. Right at the end of the stud. Let's see, I don't think I've got the right angle for you there. You can't really see how much the pipe came down with it. Let me reframe this and show you that. As you can see, this rear bracket has come down about 2 inches when we lowered the engine. And you could, if you try to push this up here, you can see it would put a lot of strain on this section of the hose if you didn't release this. So I think it's a really good idea to do that one. This front one, I can push it up there without a whole lot of effort. So this one's not as critical, but hey, as long as you're under here, it only takes a minute to release this one too. Now that we've finished whatever work we wanted to do, we'll just use the hydraulic cart to pick the engine back up and press it against there. Don't press too hard because now you're lifting the whole car. If you go beyond just making contact with the frame there, and we essentially at this point just have to go backwards and tighten, put all the nuts and bolts back in and tighten them up. The torque value for these nuts that hold the motor mount onto the frame is 48 foot-pounds. I couldn't find a torque value for the other nuts up there or nuts and bolts. I think because they're just not that critical. Just tighten them to a reasonable tightness. There you go. All done. Now, I'm sure before watching this video, the notion of lowering the engine in the Cayman probably seemed pretty daunting, but as you've now seen, it's really fairly simple. All you need is the right tools and the right knowledge. Now, before you go, please go down there, click on that thumbs up button, give me a like on the video, let YouTube know that you enjoyed it and you found it valuable. And while you're down there, if you are not one of my subscribers, please go ahead and click on that big red shiny subscribe button. Now, both of those things cost absolutely nothing, but they really help me in terms of growing the channel and producing more content. And then finally, if you want to keep up with everything that's going on here in the garage, the Cayman track car, general DIY stuff, repairs around the house, go down there and click on that bell icon. That turns on notifications for this channel, and that way YouTube will let you know every time that I post something new from here in Cliff's Garage. I will see you next time.